If I could just capture a little bit more of the legislative conversations, I think where there's really three questions that are out there, maybe four. Is there enough groundwater? Is it adequately regulated? Do we have the right property law for groundwater? And then the question that's most familiar to you, how do international trade agreements potentially impact the state's regulation of water? I would just want to keep in front of all of us that question about the property law within here, because the legislature really has that question right in front of it. A number of the bills ask the question, is the property law that governs groundwater is privately owned in Maine, is that the right structure? And that threads into, do we regulate it well enough? Does that impact how we stand with regard to international trade? You know, so that one sort of feeds both ways into regulation and international trade. And I think in the public, either in the work sessions or the public forums, to be able to have not only the public speak to their thoughts on this, but for also all of us to learn from the AG or the legal experts about this, because I think, frankly, a lot of us really don't know what it means to change from modified absolute dominion to public trust to the fourth restatement of torts to, you know, all that stuff. And I think that's a very rich area for discussion and learning by this group, and it doesn't really sit exactly in either of our charges, and I wouldn't want to lose that part of the conversation. Because the Natural Resources Committee really did run right up against that in a number of bills and said, geez, we're not really sure at this point.
Our commission is charged with assessing the impact of international trade agreements on Maine, the state of Maine, in various areas. And we are also charged with having 2 public hearings every year. That's in statute. So we will be having a public hearing this fall, and it makes sense to tie it in with this particular issue that we will be dealing with.
And certainly I've heard some statements over the last year that lead me to believe that there's a lot of misinformation about groundwater resources. So I think an overview for this committee and at the beginning of a public session would be a very useful framing of this whole issue.
You made a comment about we have now in 207, we have now in place the rules and regs on large scale, and then you went on to say that we're looking at protection of the resource, or should be looking at protection of the resource, and then you also said which watersheds are in conflict, and how's the data gathered. So my question is, how far along, how much more work do you need to identify watersheds in conflict? And
we did a very preliminary analysis, really to answer a basic question. Do we have a statewide problem, or do we have a few places to look at where we should be looking harder? And it was a statewide analysis with available information. It's not the most detailed information you'd want to, you know, pinpoint individual issues, but it answered that basic question and showed us that, well, if we prioritize from those where, and it was basically a supply and demand kind of study. How much water is available in a particular watershed? How much gets used for various uses? Human uses, how much is needed to maintain aquatic habitat in the streams and lakes, and so that was the so pulling all those things together, we did this analysis, and at one level there maybe are a dozen or so, maybe a dozen and a half watersheds where we think we ought to be looking harder. It's not to say that there are problems here. It's to say that with this general information, there's a potential that we may be, you know, running into conflicts in these places. So we have just begun that work, and to collect the kind of detailed information that you need to really look at in a watershed all the uses, all the available information. It takes it takes a couple summers of work, and we're into our second summer of work in Freeport, looking at one watershed, and working a collaborative effort with my agency, other state agencies, and the U.S. Geological Survey to try and bring all the information together in that one watershed. But, you know, I don't think he's out today, but I have one of my staff out on a weekly basis doing stream flow measurements, because that's one of the key things that you need, that the statewide, we have formulas that have been developed over decades of stream gauging to estimate flow, but when you get down to a detailed watershed, particularly small ones, you actually need, you know, direct measurements of flow to really understand all the interactions of groundwater and surface water. So we have to go through this effort of collecting information. So it's a multi-year effort, and we've only just begun.
So I guess what you're saying is you feel you have the major areas kind of identified, and now we're down to the stream flow. So, and that's how to say this. You're not into drilling, you're into flow issues. Are you outlining those areas in some other way? What's the data that you need that will take the time to do that? Human beings doing measurement streams, or other types of data?
Well, it's a labor-intensive effort. There's these streams, because of the nature of where they are and their size, require that you have somebody go out and do the measurements, rather than just having to set up an instrument on these streams would take just as long, because there are a particular set of measurements that have to be taken periodically in order to make the calculations of stream flow, even if you have instrumentation out. So yeah, it's a matter of effort. These watersheds are almost exclusively in southern coastal Maine, and a big driving factor is just population demands on water resources. So that's where they are. We also know of issues. If we could have done the effort at a finer scale with smaller watersheds, some other places would have come up as well, probably in eastern Maine and western Maine. But at the scale we were able to do this, these are the areas that showed up, and you know, that's just a matter of where we are in terms of data and resources.
Andy.